All right, well, good evening and welcome to Figure It Out. We're glad you're here. I know it only feels like we're starting at 11 p.m. and finishing up after midnight, but that's just because with the time change and with the later calendar months here, it gets dark. I mean, really dark so fast. It's amazing. So we are in session 10, our current study. If you're visiting for the first time, we welcome you. I'm Dr. Dave Newton, and we're doing a year-long study on prophecy from the Bible, with the underlying question being, has anything changed in the last 50 years? And of course, the position I have is nothing in Bible prophecy has changed, but how we interpret it has certainly become, in my opinion, much more literal due to all kinds of technological changes, telecommunications, computers, stuff going on with finance and economics, geopolitical stuff as well. So last week we were in part one of the geopolitical changes related to Israel. And starting in 2091 BC, which is when Abram was called out of Ur of the Chaldees in lower Mesopotamia there, and going all the way up through 2025. And so tonight we're going to pick up part two on that. Last week we looked at these passages. I hope you had a chance to go take a look at chapter 9, 10, 11 of Romans. As you know, Paul makes a wonderful apologetic about the nation of Israel in those three chapters. Peter does a great apologetic as well about Israel's history and how it all is consummated in the person of Jesus Christ from Nazareth, Yehoshua, a Nazarene. And then Stephen in chapter 7 makes a really long sermon there for 51 verses, 52 verses, and also gives a really nice history of Israel. And we took a look at some passages from Ezekiel and Amos, and then the three big ones I always love to quote from Jeremiah that all point to the fact that these are not passages referring to Israel coming back in the land after the Babylonian captivity. Because in every case, they're talking about the nation having been scattered across the entire globe, and then they're coming back from, the farthest reaches or the four corners and all the different nations, and that does not describe what happened with Babylon. And then we took a look at Isaiah, Deuteronomy, and of course Isaiah 66, one of my favorite passages as you consider what happened in May 14th of 1948. Can a nation be born in one day? And then we buffered both of those with the caveats from Romans chapter 11, that with all this overwhelming evidence, you would think that the Jewish people today would just be going, oh, it's so obvious. Look at all that Yahweh has done and look how clear it is. And yet, we're told, Paul even understood it for our day as well. There's a partial hardening that's gone on, and it's going to go through what's called the fullness of the Gentiles. And we're now in what's called the times of the Gentiles, also called the church age. And then I love how Isaiah chapter 5, here's from the Old Testament, this wonderful prophet story about marrying this prostitute named Gomer as a way to provide an object lesson of how Yahweh loves his wife Israel in the figurative language of the Old Testament, and yet she's always playing the harlot with all the other gods of the other nations. And yet he says, I will have to return to my place, speaking prophetically about Christ's ascension, until they acknowledge their guilt and they seek my face. And then in their affliction, which is going to come during that 70th seven coming still future, that's when they'll really seek me out earnestly, and that's when I'm going to show myself to them. So I think those are great passages. So tonight, we're going to take part two of what we set up last week, taking a look at the key starting points for Israel and the land. But the idea that a desert wasteland can flourish, and Israel has transformed pre-1948 desolate space into literally an agricultural wonder. Massive, huge irrigation projects and what we call Agri-Tech, which is agricultural technologies, to have all these major advances in crop management and how they get yields. In fact, you're going to see later in tonight's presentation in our teaching that Israel post-1948 has only about half the land arable, farmland, that they had pre-1948. And yet with half the land, instead of 2 million acres, only 1 million acre. With 1 million acres there, they end up having something like 7 times the output. So think about that. You have half the land, 7 times the yield. Pretty amazing. So one of the first passages we'll look at tonight is Leviticus chapter 25, and this is kind of what I would say kind of sets in stone really how God views his land, because he says, look, the land is not going to be sold ever into perpetuity, because the Lord is saying, Yahweh is saying, the land is mine. You're simply tenants on it. And he even says that to Israel. Yes, I've given the land to you, but he even had a provision in his law that every 49 years, 7 sevens, for 49 years, you would have a time period where you would do the regular plowing and things like that. And yet every 7th year, you would let the land lay fallow. And then in the 50th year, the Jubilee year, you forgive all the debts. So if you had a mortgage on your land, or if you owed some money on your vineyard or something like that, that would be forgiven in the 50th year. Because again, you're not technically the owner of the land. The Lord is the owner and you are the stewards. Deuteronomy 29 says very specifically, the land is going to become in the future a wasteland. And this is coming from the time of Deuteronomy, coming out of Egypt in 1440 BC. It'll be unsown, it'll have no harvests, it'll have no grass, and in fact the land did become that, so that's a fulfilled prophecy. Take a look sometime, I've used it in a couple other prior teachings over the last 10 years, but Google sometime and take a look at the memoirs of Samuel Langhorne Clemens, who we all know by his pen name as Mark Twain, and he goes to Turkey and then over to Cyprus and then takes a ship into Israel, and is there in the Holy Land after the Civil War, and he writes in his memoirs that it's a land of scorpions and rocks, nothing grows. We traveled the entire day today and saw no one. We come across some tents here and there. There's really nothing going on. And he was really surprised to find that the Holy Land, as it was referred to for them there in the late 19th century, that it was so incredibly desolate. Isaiah then says this, though. Look at verses 1 and 2 of Isaiah 35. The land rejoices, Arabah, and I know it looks like that's how you spell Arab, A-R-A-B-A-H, but Arabah is that giant desert wasteland from the Dead Sea all the way down to Eilat, which is right at the tip of the Red Sea. So if you look at a map of Israel, we'll have a few up here in a moment, but if you go from I've driven from the Dead Sea and then gone all the way south down it's about an hour and a half or so, maybe an hour, and you get down to Eilat, and it's the tip of the Red Sea. And it's interesting because right at that tip, the Arabs call it Aqaba, and it's the Gulf of Aqaba to them. We call it the Red Sea. And if you go down the western side of the sea, you leave Israel, and it's all Egypt. So think about it. Here's Israel coming down like an arrowhead, and right there is their port city of Eilat, or Aqaba is on the other side of the fence, which is what the Arabs call it in Jordan. And then down the western edge, or the western coastline, it's all Egypt. And yet if you go down the eastern, it starts as Jordan, and you go down a little bit further, and it's Saudi Arabia. And it's kind of interesting to see how they all border on that. And but he says, the land's going to rejoice, even the Arabah, which is this wasteland, and I think I referred to it before if you're a movie buff and like classic films, Lawrence of Arabia. One thing that T. Lawrence does is he helps lead all the combined clans of tribes against the Turks who are holding the port of Aqaba, and they have all their big guns. Where are they facing? Into the desert or out toward the Red Sea? Well, the Red Sea, in case anybody tries to come in with their navy, because the understanding was no one would come from the other side. It's several weeks of just nothing but desert, no water, etc. And yet he leads them across the desert, and they come in from the north in that famous charge in the movie. And he's saying that area is blossoming. And when we drove through it, they have acres and acres of date farms and dairies all through there, and all kinds of irrigation. And it says it's going to blossom like a rose, or depending how you interpret the word there in the Hebrew, or a crocus, just a beautiful flower that unfolds itself. Blossoming profusely. It'll have the glory of Lebanon given to it. And Lebanon was always known for the glorious forests of its cedars. Even today, the cedar is the main icon image on their flag in Lebanon. And you've heard all kinds of stories in the Old Testament about the cedars of Lebanon. In fact, Nehemiah was given letters from Artaxerxes that he could stop in Lebanon and they would give him all the lumber he needed to head down to rebuild the walls and the streets of Jerusalem. And the majesty of Carmel, and that's when you think about the majesty, Mount Carmel is just, you get up on that thing, it's just this gorgeous vista looking out over the plain of Megiddo, and just, it's really beautiful. And then also the majesty of Sharon, which is this rich coastal plain with all these farms. And they're saying that the Arabah, that space between the Dead Sea and the port of Eilat, that desert, is going to have the same rich growth and everything going on. And we see a lot of that today. And then in verse 7, it says, scorched land becomes a pool, thirsty ground with springs of water. In haunts of jackals, grass becomes reeds and rushes. And so what used to just be dry Marsscape, just with jackals and scorpions and snakes, they're saying, no, it's going to turn into a beautiful, lush area. And it's amazing. You drive along and they're actually growing sod in the desert that is then used for, it's a sod farm, and they're going to use it for hotels and other places around the country. Pretty interesting. Some more about the land. Ezekiel chapter 11 says, I'm going to gather you from the people and assemble you out of all the countries where you've been scattered. I'm going to give you back the land of Israel. And set that against what we know about the first time they come into the land after they've been in slavery for 400 years. Coming in Exodus chapter 23, the Lord says through Moses, look, I'm going to set your border. It's going to go from the Red Sea in the south, that's the port of Aqaba, the Eilat today. It's going to go from the Red Sea all the way up to the Sea of the Philistines, which would be, Philistia is up in the northwest coast, Tyre and Sidon, currently areas in Lebanon. So if you picture an Israeli map, you'd say all the way from that southern arrowhead tip, right down at the Red Sea, all the way up to the coast going out there by Lebanon. And then it says that's kind of your north-south. And it says, and from the wilderness, so that goes all the way across the Sinai Peninsula, because where did the people wander? In the wilderness of Zen and so forth, and when they left Egypt. So from the wilderness all the way to the Euphrates. And I put the map up last week from Genesis chapter 13 and Genesis 15 with the description of what the land looked like. And I hope your eyes popped when you realized it goes all the way from the northern coast almost up toward Turkey, all the way down to the Red Sea and all the way over to the Wadi in Egypt, which would be the Nile, and coming all the way across to the Euphrates in the delta of the Tigris and Euphrates in southern modern-day Iraq, right near Kuwait. And I always think it's interesting that that's where Abram was called out of, that same exact location in Ur, and yet the land is going to go right to his doorstep of where he was formerly. And this was the land promised them coming out of Egyptian slavery. Again, a match with later on what was promised previously to Abraham. And then later on in Ezekiel, he says, I'm going to gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered. I'm going to give you the land of Israel. And then there's this major verse that gets quoted a lot. And a lot of times out of context, there's a lot of folks who get a lot of anger and combatant in their debates with each other, because in Genesis 12, the Lord says three things. God is going to bless those who bless his people. This is as he's talking to Abram. He says, and anybody who curses his people, God will curse them. And then finally, but through you, Abram, through you and your descendants, all the world will be blessed. And certainly through the messianic line and the death of Jesus and the gospel being that he died and rose again for our sins, the whole world has truly been blessed through the ancestry of Abram. So all these are true. And yet there's this kind of almost hardline combatant mentality among some Christians that, unless you're an absolute, no holds barred, complete supporter of Israel and everything, then you're going to violate this and you'll be cursed. Many Bible commentators for last 2 to 3 centuries have said the United States could probably owe a lot of its prosperity and its good fortunes and all to the fact that the Lord's been blessing us because we have always stayed close to Israel. And so some people say, as soon as you see yourself veering off from supporting Israel and blessing them, you're going to end up in Genesis 12:3 being one of those nations that are cursed because you've been, against them. And there's a lot of good evidence for that. You can see all kinds of countries who've turned their back on Israel over the last 150 to 200 years, and their countries have obviously gone in decline. And yet the United States is conspicuously absent from Bible prophecy. And yet that means perhaps there could be a day down the line when Israel, the United States does turn its back on Israel, falls far, far away from any kind of alliance with them, and that could be the beginning of the downfall. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So when you hear about a desert wasteland that will flourish, here you can take a look and you can see, starting up at the Sea of Galilee, and there's Tiberias. I've stayed there right on the coast and of the lake, also known as the Sea of Galilee, the Sea of Tiberias. See, the Jordan River flows all the way down. And interestingly enough, when it gets to the Dead Sea, that's the end of the fresh water. If you've had a chance to go to Israel, it is pretty amazing. You put on your surf socks, walk out into the Dead Sea, just sit back. It feels like you're in a reclining chair. I mean, it's not even like you're kind of floating. No, you're literally just floating. And it's amazing. You can literally just lay back. You feel like you're on a massage table or something like that. It's that supportive. So there's nothing that you can drink there. And yet the Jordan River flowing down out of Sea of Galilee is much like our Lake Kachuma and our Lake Casitas, is completely dependent on winter rains that then feed into multiple dozens and dozens of springs. And just like we keep track of the level of Kachuma, we keep track of the level of Lake Casitas, so too the Israelis and the Jordanians do a very close watch and keep an eye on the, Sea of Galilee is at 85% right now. When they've had droughts, the sea has gone down to 65% of normal. So you know how awkward it is to see Lake Kachuma when it was, I think the lowest I ever saw it was like at 18%. And some of the areas that used to have marinas and things like that had sapling trees growing, and there were all kinds of bushes growing. And you could see the docks that used to be, and they're now like 30, 40 feet higher than the grass because the water has receded that far. Then we have a good winter rains, and all of a sudden they say, guess what? We just hit 100% of capacity. It's spilling over the dam at Gibraltar, and it's running down the San Ynez River, and it's 12 feet deep, and it's got rapids. And so again, it's interesting. They do the same thing there. That's their number one water source. Because look on the left-hand side, on the west coast, everything there is the Mediterranean Sea. And just like us, you can't drink the Pacific Ocean. I've been here 35 years, and we've had a couple of pretty intense droughts in those 35 years. And we've gone from having a desal plant put up, and just as they were ready to put it online, we had 2 winters in a row of above average rainfall. Then they're all like, oh, we don't need a desal plant, And yet you look around the world, and there are places like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Bahrain, Kuwait, and now, of course, Israel, who that's their main source of fresh water is desalinization. So let's take a look at how this works. You can see the different, these little triangles over here. There are 6 and a 7th one coming online shortly, but there are 6 desal plants, and the next one's going to be right off the coast of the Sea of Galilee. And they produce all the water that Israel needs, and in fact, Israel ends up exporting water to the Arab Emirates and also has a pact with Jordan, where Jordan has agreed, as you can see here, they have built a 600 megawatt solar energy facility and send all the energy from that to Israel on high tension wires to a dynamo, and then it's distributed into Israel. And Israel, in exchange, sends them 200 million cubic meters of water per year. Think of 200 million cubic meters. Picture a cubic meter, 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, 200 million of those. I mean, it's incredible. And where's the water from? From their desal. And it's everything that Jordan uses for its cities and for its agriculture. And then, of course, there's more than enough. Israel's got, you can count them down. There's Gaza in the lower left-hand corner. Just above it is Ashkelon and Akdad, and then it kind of goes right up through Jaffa and just south of Tel Aviv. There's one more just north of there, and then there's one desal plant just after you get past Haifa. And so, and then the 7th one is coming online shortly. Israel is also literally the poster child in agribusiness around the world. People point to the incredible we'll call it the Agricultural Technology Lab of Israel. And the lab is basically the entire land is one big laboratory, because they do advanced computerized drip irrigation, incredible water management and recycling of water, and of course, major desalinization. They have right on the cutting edge of all the major research and development, the R&D for all the innovations regarding Agri-Tech. They do genetic engineering and crop development for getting more yield out of their grains and the seeds that they plant. Also to make them, resistant to any kinds of pests. They do computerized harvesting. They use drones that are actually unmanned and are flown by the computer to go and literally check all the crops by flying over them and taking, the one camera takes, I think it's 90 images a second as it flies over and processes all of that and figures out when stuff is ready to be picked. The old days of a farmer walking through his field trying to decide when to harvest, that's all gone. Now it's all electronic. They have special soil conditioners. It's amazing that land that in and of itself, they would say, is literally just desert. It's what you would see going out to Palm Springs or Palm Desert or going out to Las Vegas. It's just moonscape. And yet that has been converted into thick, rich, nutrient-rich soil with plenty of water from the Mediterranean. It's been desalinized. And suddenly you can have all these amazing, amazing farms. And they have reclaimed millions of acres of desert and turned them into farmlands. So it's literally, and they don't like to use the word in the world, but it is a miracle that this place about the size of New Jersey, that is nothing but the same landscape as Palm Springs and Palm Desert and Yucca Valley and going all the way out to Vegas. That kind of landscape is now considered rich agricultural farmland, and it has yields just off the charts. And the other thing that they boast about, I always think it's fun. I have all these databases that have fun facts about Israel. They have the #1 production from cows in the world. A typical cow who's milked 7 days a week, on average around the world, gives around 8,000 liters of milk a year. So a liter, you can figure, not a gallon, a little more than 4 liters makes a gallon. So you can picture what 1 liter looks like. Figure 8,000 of those. Israeli cows, based on the diets that they're given, all natural, no hormones, no antibiotics, all these other things. And yet they have figured out the way to filter their water and the vitamins they give them and the corn that they eat and things like that. They do 12,000 liters per cow per year. And it's the envy of the world. Nobody's even close to that. So normally about 8,000, 8,500 liters per cow per year. I never saw a cow in New Jersey, so it was they were only in books. So, I'm certainly not a farmer, but it's really interesting to read about the advances in farm and agricultural technologies, dairy technologies that have literally put Israel in a position where they still import most of their beef and they still import most of their chicken. But in other areas, they are a net exporter. And you'll see in a moment, one of the big ones is in tropical fruits. So when you hear of things like mangoes and bananas and tangerines and oranges and lemons and limes, you picture some really nice, place in the Pacific Islands or something like that. And yet you come to find out Israel supplies a lot of its Arab neighbors and almost all of Europe with their exotic, fruits like that. And here's one of their desal plants. This is the one that is right south of Tel Aviv there. I think this is the Ashkelon. And you can see, as you know, the water has to go through multiple layers of filtration systems. Just picture every one of these is like a cartridge filter that gets dropped in. Of course, it's 35 feet high and 100 feet long. That's a pretty big, filter cartridge. But that's how long the cartridges go. And you can see the seawater coming in there on the far left as the tide and the waves come in. It just keeps bringing in seawater, filters it all the way through, processes it all, and then sends it out across the country. And they have all these really great aqueducts that are fully covered and protected. And they have all the water they need. When I've been in the Emirates, in Dubai, same thing. You think to yourself, here's this place that's just in the middle of nothing. It's just desert in every direction. And yet they've got all this amazing fresh water. They have irrigation. They have lawns and palm trees and all kinds of fruit trees. They have botanic gardens. And yet, where's the water come from? It comes right there from the salt water. So again, obviously, the scriptures don't have verses that say, and there will be desalinization plants in the future, right? But it does say that it's going to flourish and the waters are going to flow. And certainly I view this as, again, another amazing technological advancement that shows us that you can take the Bible literally. That's the whole key on everything we're covering here, is that the literal interpretation of the prophecies. These are not figurative. These are not analogies. These are not metaphors. These are literal. And if you had read this, something simple, how about just 100 years ago, 1925? What was going on in 1925? We'll have a timeline toward the tail end tonight. 1925, the best records we have say that any farming that was going on in Palestine at that time was just subsistence. You would have a small farm for yourself. But they did not have agribusinesses, and they did not have enough to be able to do exports or anything like that. It was subsistence farming. And there were no farm markets and all the things we have today. Here's the plants. You can see them. So it starts down here with the plants. So here's Jerusalem is down this way on the southeast side here. So here's Ashkelon, the one at Ashdod, and then Palachim, and then Sorek A and Sorek B. And then the newest one I added in here because they had it listed as it's going to start up here by the coastline, filtering water that comes into the Sea of Galilee. And picture that. Can you imagine if we had that kind of water management here where you said, oh, we had a couple of bad years of drought. So we have a plant up around, maybe we'll say right around Gaviota. And that plant fires up and starts desalinization of Pacific Ocean water, sends it through a pipeline up over into Kachuma and fills up the lake when there's not enough natural rain. And so they don't ever worry any longer about there being a big drought, and so they can just fill up Sea of Galilee or the Sea of Tiberias. And you can see, so there are now 7 of these plants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and number 7 is called Birkat Miriam. And pretty interesting, the biblical names they give to these things, kind of tying in with the finding of water in the desert. Kind of interesting. And so that's supposed to open actually pretty soon. Did a couple searches online, and they said it's in a test, not quite fully operational, but it's all fully constructed and ready to go. And it's so logical when you stop and think. You're right next to the Mediterranean Sea, and you go, gee, we don't have any water. And you just look again and you go, well, we do. And that's when you think the Emirates and Qatar and Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and Oman and Yemen and now Israel, they say there's no problem. We don't have to be dependent on when it rains or not. And if you had just any kind of foresight, and you can imagine who I'm talking to right at this point, right? Santa Barbara could have a plant that would basically say, hey, when we have lots of rains and it fills up our reservoirs, great. And if we have a year of drought or so, we just take it out of the ocean, send it up the desal water. Everything runs the same way. You don't have to worry about drought. Isaiah 27, verse 6. In those last days, Israel will take root. It's going to blossom. And then bring forth its produce. And this was another one of those terms. Callie, you and I were talking before we started tonight about literal interpretations versus figurative. And look at that last thing. Bringing forth its produce to do what? To fill the whole world with fruit. And again, you would read that in 1928 or 1937 or, whatever, and you would say, or in the 1800s, or you're a theologian at Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere in Germany in the 1700s, and you would just say, well, Palestine, even if the Jews do go back, of course, they're not going to ever be back in the land. That's all figurative. And yet, how could there possibly be produce sent to all over the world from Israel? Why would anybody, who would buy something from Israel? They don't grow anything anyway. And yet you're going to see in a moment some export figures. And it's pretty amazing to think that so many countries in Europe, they go into their breakfast refrigerator area in the middle of winter or something like that, and there's bananas and tangerines and limes and lemons and mangoes. And where do they come from? Israel, 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 Israel. Isn't that interesting? Their produce will fill the whole world with fruit, and it literally gets shipped everywhere. Ezekiel 36, verses 8, 9, and 10. The mountains will have branches bearing fruit of the people. The land will be cultivated and planted with crops. God will multiply the inhabitants who live there and the livestock across the land. And again, this is another passage where you can go back to some old commentaries, 100, 150 years ago. Sometimes they have sections on PDF scans that are available on the web. I have a few old books at home I've collected over the years when I've been able to go to a certain library. And I don't know if you ever try this out, but if you check an old book that is like a copyright 1894 and it hasn't been checked out for 37 years, sometimes the librarian will just say, you know, for $5 you can have that. And so I've picked up a bunch of these Bible commentaries over the years that way. Some just give them to you for free. They say, when was the last time that was checked out? And you look at the card in the back and 1933, you know, or something. And it's a book from 1894 or something like that. And they'll say, you know what, if you'd like, you can just take it. Because they're basically saying it just takes up shelf space and nobody uses it. But we know in there, there's insights into where replacement theology got its start, which was that none of these prophecies could possibly be literally true. Because, first of all, how will there ever be Israel in the land? Anybody who ever went there came back and just said, ain't going to happen. There's no way it could happen. And it wasn't even just that the land was so bad. It's like, where are the Jews? They're everywhere. You're going to see in a moment, right after the Declaration of Independence in 1948, when they became a nation, to see the countries where the Jews came from, because they now had a land to go to, you're going to see things like they came from Yemen, they came from Libya, they came from Egypt, they came from Ethiopia. I mean, it's pretty, of course, all of Europe post-World War II. And so it's pretty amazing to think when you read something like, multiply the inhabitants and the livestock across the land, cultivated with crops planted, produce that will fill the whole world with its fruit. These were all considered to be some form of, you know, figurative language. Maybe it was pointing back to the time of, in hindsight, when they came into the land after being in slavery, because Ezekiel and Isaiah are writing, 6th century BC, and the Exodus is the 14th century BC. So that's 800 years prior, so they can't be prophecy. You don't prophesy about things that already happened, right? Make sense? Okay. Or look at verses 33 to 38. The desolate land will be tilled. Well, first off, I'm not an Agri-Tech big farm guy, of course, or anything like that, but I've had a few commentaries I've read over the years from guys who have really big backgrounds in agricultural technology, and they say that first line, a desolate land being tilled, is like an oxymoron. Nobody tills the desert. Does that make sense? And we would miss that as we read it too quickly, and I'm always reminded to say, don't forget to remind in my teaching that this has been brought up to me, 3 or 4 times in the last 4 decades. The desolate land is tilled. Who tills a desolate land? Right? Can you imagine driving out toward Vegas and you just see this one section is just, you know, acres and acres and acres of just nothing, some scrub brush and some moonscape and Marscape rocks and stuff, and you would go out there with a hoe or something and start scraping it, thinking you're going to till it. It's like concrete, right? It's just dust. It's like scraping concrete off of a parking garage or something like that. Nothing would grow there. And yet he's saying what? The desolate land's going to be tilled, not be a wasteland. And then I love this one. And observers, those who come by and watch, observers are going to say this, quote, the desolate wasteland is now like Eden. Wow. Eden was what? Lush. All kinds of fruits and vegetables just growing in abundance. And he's going to say, you know what? That wasteland, it's now kind of like Eden. The desolate ruined cities are also now rebuilt and inhabited. So again, these kinds of passages for centuries were considered proof that the Bible's prophecy areas are either all metaphor and not literal, or these aren't prophecy, these are looking back at some other times in history or something. And yet they're all in the context of the prophet Ezekiel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, all looking forward to the end times. And this one is another of my favorites. Amos chapter 9, verses 14 and 15. My people will live in rebuilt cities that were in the past in ruins. They will plant vineyards, and they're going to drink the wine that comes from those vineyards. They're going to make gardens. They'll eat all the fruit that they plant. And he says, the Lord says, I'm going to plant them. So picture this. Not only are they going to do planting, I love this passage. Not only are they going to put vineyards down and enjoy the wine and have gardens and eat all the produce from their gardens, but he says, I'm going to plant them in a desolate land. It's almost like he's saying figuratively, but literally, I'm going to plant them in this desolate place, and they will never be rooted out of the land again. So that's to say, if you take the Bible literally and you take prophecy seriously, we are the generation that not only sees Israel in the land, but we can know that they will never, in our time, ever see them uprooted. So anybody who's fearful of, oh, you think this could be the end of Israel, oh, you think Israel could, well, the scriptures say they're never going to be rooted out of the land once they've been brought back in from every country across the entire nations, 4 corners of the globe. All those languages are all pointing toward the fact that we're in that time right now. We are alive to see it. Remember our buddy Clarence Larkin? I think a couple of you said you actually went online and Googled him, saw a nice old photo of him from like 1917 with his little beard and his wireframe glasses, and he was a wonderful theologian. And some of the best writings he did were between 1898 and 1916. And he was one of those guys who was so faithful to God's word, but he openly said, I myself can't see how any of this stuff could be fulfilled literally, comma. However, the Lord said it, so I've got to believe that something we haven't seen yet, somewhere down the line, maybe in a year or two, maybe further. Well, think about it. He died, I think, in 1924, and his last real time of being a prolific writer was probably 1917, 1918, just around the beginning of the First World War. His major works, 1911, 1910, 1914. So can you imagine, from his perspective, he didn't know that he was still 38 years away from Israel going back in the land and being an independent nation. Imagine if you had told him, hey, Clarence, in 38 years, Israel's going to be a nation again. I mean, he would have just been, wait, what? 1948, right? And so when you think about all those passages, you recognize that we have such a different perspective from where we sit today. Because, again, filling the whole world with fruit, I love this statement in Amos, the one who's plowing starts to catch up with the one who's harvesting. Do you realize how that's not just like an accidental, riddle or something? That's literally a farmer would recognize. Can you imagine getting to a place where the big equipment that's out there tilling the ground and putting down the seed is actually catching right up to those who are harvesting the crops? Because that's how quickly the turnover is. They're saying in some cases they have 3 harvests a year because of the way they manage the land. Those who are trampling or processing the grapes into wine, they catch up to those who are out planting and tending the vines. I think that's great as well. You got folks who are already just enjoying this bumper crop at a time when others are just getting out there and either planting brand new vineyards or tending the existing ones, getting them ready for the harvest. So pre-1948, the West Jezreel Valley and the Hula Valley, which is north of Tiberias. So if you're looking at Israel, just north of Jerusalem and Mount Carmel, you would look out over the plain of Megiddo or the plain of Jezreel. And that's where those big battles of Armageddon are going to take place in the end times. And then you can see Mount Carmel there and stuff. And then all the way up to the Sea of Galilee, there's the capital, the city of the province there called Tiberias. And then just north of that is Dan, and then it goes up into Caesarea Philippi and the Golan Heights. And just north of that, the big Hula Valley. So you got Hola Valley, and then you've got West Jezreel Valley. Pre-1948, these were bogs. I mean, the best descriptions when you read the stuff about the folks who went to them said, just picture mud about 5 feet deep, just really thick, always kind of wet, but not really enough to do anything, and just nothing grows. It smells. Any water that's there is stagnant. Major breeding grounds for mosquitoes, and nothing grows there. I mean, you can't grow anything. Post-1948, coming out to today, with precision Agri-Tech, the use of AI, unmanned drones managed by computers, real-time metrics, they can literally tell you how much water is in the soil right at this moment with the soil detecting the systems they have. Water yield planning, advanced soil sensors, proactive pest detection and mitigation of those, and then advanced packaging. They've come out with packaging that can take produce from the field and keep it literally like it's just been picked for anywhere from 11 to 14 days, which gives it plenty of time to be distributed all throughout Europe and all throughout North Africa. And when that stuff arrives in the fruit stands at the bazaars and at the markets, and it says, oh, product of Israel, it looks like it was picked this morning. That's because of the packaging that they've come up with to ship it. Anti-moisture wraps, and it allows them to literally be an exporter to the world, which it says at the top, what will fill the whole world with its fruit. Literal prophecy that absolutely can be and is taken literally, being fulfilled. Here's some data. The most recent full year, they're still compiling 2024, but the most recent data we have was through the third quarter of 2024. But the last full year was 2023. Exports were $2.7 billion of fruits and vegetables were exported. Imagine growing enough stuff and feeding all your people. You have plenty for all your grocery stores and supermarkets, everything like that, and yet you have another $2.7 billion worth US of produce that can be shipped out of the country. Avocados, oranges, lemons, limes, grapefruits, dates, all these things. The top buyers of Israeli produce are the United Kingdom, France, Holland, Germany, and Russia. Isn't that interesting? I always think to myself, maybe when it says that I'm going to put my hooks in your jaw, O Gog, and I'm going to bring you down, it might be to come get avocados or something. Who knows? So, and then fresh flowers. They grow flowers year-round. We drove by some amazing. It's almost like driving through the 126 going out toward Magic Mountain, and you just see when they're in full bloom on both sides, all those nurseries. And in Israel, same thing, just fields of just pink and yellow and red roses and everything. You think to yourself, this is the desert, and they're growing roses. They're growing tulips. They're growing poppies, all these things. In fact, they're number 3 in the world behind Holland and Kenya. And you know why Kenya is number 2? Because Kenya has borrowed all of Israel's technology to basically create a huge crop of flowers that they can then be a major exporter around to Europe. The farmland pre-1948 was about 2 million acres in Palestine. So if you looked at Palestine pre-1948, sometime in the 20s or the 30s, there were around 2 million acres that were being tilled or being farmland. 97% of that was subsistence farming. So that was just for a small village, or an individual person had their own farm for themselves. 85% of those arable lands were owned by Arabs. Only 15% were Jewish. Those 2 million represented just a little over a third of the 6 million acres of British Palestine. That's how much was being tilled. The 85% Arab owned, there were in the land at the time, pre-48, there were 2 million Arabs, and there were about 600,000 Jews. So 2 million to 600,000, it's about a 3.5 to 1 ratio. Make sense? Okay. And no one wants to talk about this, but few, if any of them, called themselves Palestinians. They were either from Egypt, or they were from Libya, or they're from Tunisia, or they're from Morocco, or they were from Kuwait, or they were from Arabia, or they were from Oman, or they were from Yemen, or they were from Transjordan, and they just identified as Arabs who happened to live in British Palestine. And interestingly enough, we'll see in a moment too, that the Jews who lived there were called Jewish Palestinians. So there were Arab Palestinians and Jewish Palestinians, because Palestine was really just the name of the land where you were living, this British Palestine from the World War I British mandate. Because remember, the Turks were in control of Jerusalem and that area from 1517 to 1917, 400 years, the Ottoman Turks. They're not Arabs. They're Muslims, but they're Turks. And the Ottoman Empire was ruling that whole area, but they sided with the Kaiser in the First World War. So when the British were taking care of the Middle East and the battles going on in Flanders and the French and German borders there and stuff, down here in the Middle East, Israel fell to the British, and the British basically took over the whole area. And then in the northern areas, which are modern-day Syria and Lebanon, that was taken over by the French. So there was a British mandate in Palestine, and there was a French mandate in Syria, Lebanon. That's why Syria and Lebanon have a lot of French in their culture, and that's why a lot of the British culture survived in Israel. And the big thing about the pre-1948 farmland was virtually no exports. Nothing was being exported from farming. Post-1948, take a look, only 1 million acres were being tilled. Up to today, right now, they don't, because so much of the other land is used for highways and freeways and cities and places, business parks and housing. And only now it's only about 20% of Israel's land. It used to be over a third of all of the land in Palestine was farmable. Now it's only about 20%. And yet the yield outputs are anywhere from 10 to 18 times what they used to do with a larger amount. So larger land had smaller output than just 1 million acres because of all the Agri-Tech. Here's their, this is from 2024, their biggest trading partners. The exports are in the dark blue, the imports are in the light blue. You can see we're their biggest trading partner, but China's right there as well. They import from China quite a bit, only export a small amount. We buy a lot from them. A lot of technology comes from Israel to the United States. You see India, the UK, Ireland, Netherlands, Turkey, Belgium, Brazil, Germany, etc. So you get an idea of, it's about $62 billion of exports and $92 billion of imports. They do have a trade deficit, about $30 billion. But to think of a small nation that's that tiny, actually exports $62 billion worth of technology, all kinds of goods, and mostly flowers and agricultural products. Pretty amazing. Quick synopsis as we close tonight on this topic. From 1000 BC to 1947, and I say synopsis because I am not a historian. I'm not here to, give you the detailed every possible topic and subtopic, but just give you an overview if you're having a conversation. The land for, 700 years, going back to, even 800 years, going back to the time of Abraham, was basically Canaan. And the Canaanites lived there. They're the first people to live there. David and Solomon, of course, David captured the city from the Jebusites, Jerusalem, and the city of peace there. And then they were taken over by Babylon, then the Medo-Persian Empire, then Greece. Then there was the Jewish Hasmonean kingdom. And the Hasmoneans, if you have a Jewish background, you know that in the 2nd century BC, in 167, there was the defiling of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, and he went in there and basically slaughtered a pig on the altar and did not go over very well with the Jews at that time. And they had the revolt that was led by Judas Maccabees. And 3 years later, in 164, they rededicated the cleansed temple, and we call that the Feast of Dedication. And you can read in the New Testament that Jesus, in John chapter 10, goes up to the temple to celebrate the Feast of Dedication, which today is now morphed into Hanukkah. And yet the Maccabees conquered almost all of Palaestina, and it became a vassal little, subholding of Rome. And finally, when Pompey came in, the general in 63 BC, he annexed everything as part of the Roman Empire, and that was the end of the Hasmonean kingdom. that goes all the way out to 70 AD when Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus goes in and levels Jerusalem and the temple. And that takes you then, basically, it was Hebrew, it was Israelite, it was Jewish, however you want to call it, from about 1000 BC to 70 AD. So almost 1100 years, it was all Jewish homeland. By 135, Hadrian was the emperor, and I've shown you this before. He named the land Palaestina, and he changed the name of Jerusalem to Alia Capitolina, and made it I showed you the map last week, made it a city dedicated to Jupiter and to Zeus and to all the Greco-Roman gods. It was in 324, about 200 years later, that Constantine renamed the city Jerusalem again, took it back to its old name. By 1099, you have the Crusades, and it was called the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And that was established by the European armies that came down to, in essence, take back the Holy Land. But not long after that, the Sultanate of Saladin came in, and Arab Muslim rule took over from 1187 all the way out to about the 1200s. The Mongols, if you knew your history, the Mongols came in under Hulagu Khan and basically took over the whole area after conquering Baghdad and Syria. They just came down the coast, did a little takeover of Jerusalem for a while. But very quickly, the Egyptian Mamluks came up from Egypt, and they got rid of the Mongols. And they also went up to Acre, or as we call Akko in Hebrew, or Acre, which is the city there on the coast. That was the last stronghold of the Crusaders from Europe, and kicked them all out by 1291. And so from 1291 on to 1517, it was Arab-Egyptian ruled. So it's Muslim, but it's Arab rule. Everybody okay with that? So it's Arabs who are in charge, even though they're Muslims. Because then the next 400 years, it's still Muslim controlled, but it's not Arabs, it's Turks, okay? The Ottoman Turks. And think about 400 years, that's even longer than our country's been around. And then the World War I, the British Mandate, went from 1920 or 23, depending how you look at when they officially signed off. It's supposed to go to 1948. The British finally put their hands up in 1947 and said, hey, the United Nations is ready to partition the British Mandate. And I'll just make a quick comment, we'll see it in a moment. That first partition could have been the solution that would have taken care of everything. There would have been a Arab Palestine and a Jewish Palestine. And Jewish Palestine would have had West Jerusalem as its capital, and Arab Palestine would have had East Jerusalem as its capital. And had both sides agreed to that, that would have been it. The problem is the Arabs don't want Israel at all to be in the land. It's not a matter of, oh, they have too much land, or they're in the land. They need to be out. So Britain gives that up. The UN recommends partitioning it. And anybody who lived in Palestine at that time was a Palestinian. There were Jewish Palestinians, there were Turkish Palestinians, and there were Arab Palestinians. But there's nobody, and again, there's all kinds of historians who would come up here and beat me up and throw me off the stage saying there's no such thing as real Palestinians. But anybody who lived in Palestine said, yeah, I come from Palestine. I'm British Palestine. Could have been the Arab Palestine. There were Arabs, Turks, and there were Christians, and there were Jews. And so were they Palestinians? Well, in 1947, when they would have set this up, I just mentioned Arab Palestine with East Jerusalem, Jewish Palestine with West Jerusalem as its capital. That never happened. So the thing you see highlighted in blue never happened. It was on paper. The Jews agreed to it. Some of the folks negotiating on behalf of the Arabs agreed to it, but when it came time to put it in place, everybody rejected it from the Arab side. They just said, we're not going to do it. So they invaded. Whereas Israel goes what? They say, great, they've given us our land, they've granted us our space, we're going to declare independence. The UN voted, and they were approved. The Arabs, on the other hand, said, we're not going to stand for this because we're not going to share the land with Israel. You have to understand, that's the fundamental basis for prophecy, is Israel is being told by the Arabs, we will not share the land with you under any circumstances. No matter how you divide it up, we looked at Ehud Barak last week and others in the peace process. there's no way that they could configure it that would be acceptable to the Arabs. So right after they declared independence, there was an Arab-Israeli war. Israel defends itself, and during that time, 750,000 Arabs in Palestine leave. It's called the Nakba. And the Nakba, they go to Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. And many of them have gone back to where? Their home country. They had Syrian origins. They were living in Palestine. They were Arabs. They had original from Lebanon. They were originally from Jordan. They were originally from Egypt. And they then moved back to where they were from. 800,000 Jews who, now think of this in reverse. You have 750,000 Arabs living in British Mandate Palestine. The war breaks out. They leave and go back to Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. 800,000 Jews who are living in Yemen and Somalia and Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt and Libya and all throughout Europe post-World War II, Poland, Germany, Austria, etc. What do? They come into Israel. So you have 750,000 going out and 800,000 coming in. That's a net 1.5 million turnaround. And Jordan goes ahead then and says, well, at least we can do this. We're going to annex the West Bank and we're going to annex East Jerusalem, because that was on the table, and Jordan had agreed, as King Hussein was one of the negotiators in the deal, that would partition Palestine. And he says, let's at least hold on to the West Bank, and let's hold on East Jerusalem. And then Gaza, who held Gaza? Egypt, because Gaza goes right down into the Sinai Peninsula, which is Egypt. Can you picture that on the map, right? Okay. So that's where everything was basically settling at. Then in 1964, the PLO was founded. And remember what PLO stands for: Palestine Liberation Organization. It was designed on paper to do one thing. It has only one thing in its charter: to liberate Palestine. That's code for get rid of all of the Jews. And so the PLO was founded in 1964. It adopted a charter that was basically, we will never, ever agree to any partition plan, ever. So even the one from 1947, 17 years earlier, will never agree to one. The only plan we'll agree to is all the land is ours, Arab Palestinians, and Israel is gone. 3 years later comes the Six-Day War. We covered a little bit of this last time. Israel defends itself, gains all this additional land. They take over the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, they occupy the West Bank, and they do what? They take over East Jerusalem. They take over the entire city for the first time in 2,000 years. They then start building settlements on the West Bank, and of course, the Arabs attack them. They rebuffed the attack and started building settlements, and then they're like, that's a foul. Time out. We want the land back that you're occupying. I don't know if you see that as kind of ironic, but I think it's interesting. 2 years later, in 1969, Yasser Arafat, 5 years after the PLO was founded, Yasser Arafat becomes the head of the PLO. He's the face, he's the voice. Where was he born? In Cairo, Egypt. But he claims to be a Palestinian, okay? He has Egyptian mother and father the mother happened to be living in British Palestine. And so he essentially is just completely against Israel. And all those photos I showed you the last several weeks with him with Bill Clinton and with Ehud Barak, and he's always smiling and stuff like that, he would never, ever go the final step, which would be agree to any kind of a two-state system. There's only one state system that he would agree to, and that's all Arab Palestine, and then get rid of the Jews. Then comes Black September, 1970, and that's when King Hussein actually does armed battle for about 28 days with the PLO in September of 1970. And the Black September was amazing. The whole world sat and watched, wow, here's Jordan fighting the PLO. And then the following summer, 71, Jordan expels the PLO out of Jordan, because Jordan recognizes that there is going to be a two-state system. Israel is going to be in the land. There's no way you can undo that. Let's go back to what we had from 1947 and have the partition plan go back in place again. Meanwhile, Israel's holding on to what? The Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, and most of the West Bank. Now we get to 1973, the Yom Kippur War. even more lands under Israel control. The Beirut post-French mandate, Beirut was called the Paris of the Mediterranean. If you look at the old photos from the early 1970s, they had all these cafes right along the Mediterranean, the water's lapping in, and people are sitting outside sipping lattes, and they speak French. 75, Lebanon has a civil war, Christians versus Muslims. PLO jumps in on the side of the Muslims. You end up with 150,000 civilians killed. 1 million Lebanese leave and go to Syria, Egypt, other places. And the fighting continues for 15 years, all the way to 1990. In 1982, prior to that, Hezbollah, backed by Iran, moves into the control of Lebanon. They had an election and they actually won power, and so Hezbollah becomes the rulers in Lebanon. 1994, the Fatah faction of the Palestinian Authority, which is under Yasser Arafat, they're now ruling Gaza. Here's the one that's most troubling, is the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. You can read all kinds of papers on this. They did an audit from 1995 to 2000 called What Happened to All the Palestinian Aid Given by the First World to Help Palestine Establish Itself. $900 million, almost $1 billion. Remember, this is in 1994 dollars. In today's dollars, it would be looking for somewhere around $4 billion. Where did it go for? It was completely unaccounted for. People are in poverty, Gaza, the West Bank, other places, refugee camps. Meanwhile, Yasser Arafat, he has a home in Switzerland. He has another one, a seaside, place here and there. And they've tracked down that he had accounts in Swiss banks and other places. They estimated his net worth at the time of his death to be somewhere between $1.4 and $2.3 billion. And yet he was in this for the sole purpose of, taking care of the Palestinian people. He died in Clamart in France in 2004, but he's now buried in Ramallah on the West Bank, and they still treat it as a big shrine. And if you were to ever show local Arabs the evidence from the IMF audit about what happened to almost $1 billion of aid that was diverted to the leaders of the PLO, they just look the other way and they say, no, he was a great leader and we all look up to him. Hamas comes in and takes over and expels Fatah. That's after Arafat's death, about 3 years later. They kick him and his team out of Gaza, the Fatah group of the Palestinian Authority, and now Gaza is run by Hamas. So you've got Hamas running Gaza and you've got Hezbollah running Lebanon, both Iranian puppets. And Israel and Egypt put together a sea, air, and land blockade of Gaza. Interestingly, Egypt joined in that as well as a way to try to stifle off that takeover, that coup. Last two slides. 2008 to 2009, Gaza is Iran's base for rockets fired into Israel. You remember this. This is pretty more, that's only 17 years ago. Oh no, 7 years ago. No, 17 years ago. Oh my goodness, isn't it amazing 2008 was 17 years ago? Oh my gosh. Israel responds, you have our first Gaza war, it's about 22 days. In 2012, Israel kills the head of Hamas military, and that results in an 8-day conflict and then a ceasefire. 2014, Hamas comes and kidnaps those 3 Israeli teenagers, remember that? And that resulted in 50-day conflict back and forth, Hamas and Israel. 2018-19, there was the big, what was called the Great March to the Return. They thought that maybe 1 million Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank could just march over the border and take over the land. And that massive, massive battle ensued from that. By 2021, Hamas was firing rockets into Israel almost all the time, and Israel was retaliating. They had an 11-day conflict. 2022, Israel seeks to wipe out the PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and they had a 10-day conflict on that before a ceasefire was brokered. 2023, Hamas surprises Israel by killing 1,200 civilians, taking 240 hostages in the October invasion. And in 2024, Israel responds with their number one goal: we are going to finally wipe out Hamas. And in doing so, they pretty much leveled almost all of Gaza. 2025, from January to September, big stalemate on what's going to happen next. And of course, October last month, the US, Qatar, Turkey, and Egypt put together a quote-unquote peace deal. And we've looked at that a little bit in prior weeks. So we'll close with this. Here's the Israel-occupied territory today. You have the West Bank and Golan. You have Gaza, and then Israel's in the light tan. And we said before, phase 1 was the ceasefire and the returning of the hostages. There's no date yet for phase 2 because it all hinges first on is Hamas voluntarily disarming. We said that's probably never going to happen. If they did, there'd then be this international stabilization force and there'd be a Gaza interim government. And then way down the line would be Palestine becoming statehood and things like that. So many of you emailed me, saw me afterwards, all kinds of things, and asked me, Dave, what's next? So this will be my last slide to close this out. Well, what's next is point number 6. The first 5 points of the peace plan have all been pretty much agreed to, which was the ceasefire, the exchange of hostages, other things like that. But point number 6 was Hamas would have to disarm and they would be given safe passage out of Gaza. And of course, that's not happening right now. The 20-point peace plan, 1 through 5, is covered, but 6 is not going to happen. 7, 8, and 9 is restoring full aid to Gaza and putting in a new governing body. That can't happen until Hamas disarms. 10 and 11 are to create economic redevelopment and a big free trade zone. That can't happen unless point 6 takes place. Point 12 is no one will be forced to leave Gaza. It's voluntarily. You can either stay or you can go, but you have to agree to live in peace, and Hamas has to be disarmed. So again, it's dependent on number 6. 13 and 14 is no Hamas at all in the Gaza government. That'll be monitored by the regional partners. The International Stabilization Force, point 15, would have to be in place, and we're still way far away from that because we haven't gotten over point 6. Israel will not annex Gaza. They can't do that. That would be that would kill the plan. Number 17, if Hamas delays on anything, aid will only go to the areas under the IDF and ISF, but we don't have those areas right now. 18, 19, and 20, Israel and Palestinian will have peaceful coexistence, and they'll start having dialogue about a plan to statehood for Palestine. And we're back then again to what we started off with, Genesis chapter 12. God will bless those who bless his people. He'll curse those who curse them. Through all the world, through you, Abraham, and your descendants, all the world will be blessed. So that's still prophetic about Jesus Christ dying on the cross and the gospel going throughout the world. But we're still hung up today on this last component. So with regard to end times prophecy, the people who live at the center of the world are taken from the nations, gathered out from all countries, brought back into their own land. They're restoring Israel's fortunes, bringing them back into the land that I gave their fathers. I'm going to return to my place until they acknowledge their guilt and seek my face. It's in their affliction, the time of the tribulation. That's when they will earnestly seek me. And yet, here we are today. Every day you wake up, Zechariah 12:2, Jerusalem is what? A cup of staggering or trembling for all the people around it. It is the number one political topic in the world, just as Zechariah said. And yet there's a partial hardening going on in Israel, but it's only partial, and it's going to end at the time of the fullness of the Gentiles. Because even Jesus said, Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot, and it still is today, until the times of the Gentiles has been fulfilled. And so we still see that today. And one last comment about, the literal interpretation of prophecy. Every one of these countries listed in all of the prophetic statements about the end times have been clearly identified. They are countries in today's modern world, members of the UN, and are in place, ready to go for when the Lord's timing would have that be. So literally everything we could look at in all these passages 100 years ago, 150, 175 years ago, none of those could have been viewed as literal interpretations. And yet here we are today. Virtually everything I read through this evening literally is fulfilled, being fulfilled, can be fulfilled. And that should give you great, great trust and confidence that the scriptures are true. Now, I also recognize that there are lots of other prejudices on how you interpret this information that would be more of a pro-Palestinian, anti-Jewish way of doing it. And so I'm sure you can imagine how everything I covered tonight could be completely thrown out by a different interpretation or a different lens. Next week, we're going to continue looking at things in the modern world. Has anything changed in 50 years that makes prophecy more literal? And we're going to switch gears a little bit from geopolitical stuff. We're going to take a look at AI, artificial intelligence. I'm even going to give you a nice little introduction to how AI works and what it looks like. And we're going to do part 1. There are a couple of things in Bible prophecy that literally, in my opinion, are speaking of AI. and that AI is the most logical way that some of these things will be fulfilled. And so we'll do 2 parts. So next week is the 17th, Monday night. We'll do part 1 on AI and literal fulfillment of Scripture, prophecy. The following week's the 24th. That's the Monday of Thanksgiving. We're going to take the week off, okay? Then we come back after Thanksgiving. Can you believe it? It's December 1st, the Monday after. We'll do part 2 of AI, okay? So we got next week, part 1 AI. Then we're off for Thanksgiving week. Can you believe Thanksgiving week is in 2 weeks? Wow. What happened to July, right? Okay. And then we'll be back on December 1st for part 2. So let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this time in your word. And again, Lord, we're just amazed when we look at history, how it's rolled out. We look at the technologies, the Agri-Tech. We look at the desert blooming, exporting to the world, all the different passages, Lord, from so many of your prophecies. Israel is in the land, and we are alive at that time. Lord, we have firsthand, right in front of our eyes, understanding of Bible prophecy so different from those just 100 years ago, 75 years ago, 90 years ago, 200 years ago. And Lord, we also see time and again all these statements that are made in the scriptures prophetically, Lord, can be and even are being fulfilled right now in front of our eyes because of the advances in technology, telecommunications, geopolitical changes going on, financial, economic changes going on. Lord, it is an exciting time to watch the Middle East. And yet, Zechariah said that one little tiny city, Jerusalem, is going to be a cup of trembling or staggering for all those around it. And it truly is, even as we are here today. So I thank you, Lord, that your word is true. I thank you we can look at it and recognize the incredible validity and veracity of your scriptures, Lord. And thank you that we're at this time in our lives, in this time in 2025, here in the 21st century, that we get a chance to see Israel in the land and all these various prophecies literally happening and coming to life, having already happened, many of them, and even those that are still on the horizon, Lord, recognizing they are easily able to be done because of advances that have happened in the last 50 years. So I pray you'd encourage our hearts. Let us be good students of the word. I pray we'd be very excited. We wouldn't be gloomy and down, but we would say, wow, what an exciting time to be alive, and read the headlines and see what's going on with regard to prophecy. So thank you for this time. I pray for a blessing on everybody who is here this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.